I'm going to do is take you to the other side of the planet, to some rather obscure islands, and look at how little things work in that region. So I hope to entertain you. And if you can stay with the story in the end, I hope that you'll find that some of what we talk about here actually may be relevant to some of the questions that people talk about here. So with that promise, if you can stay with me, off we go. So as Louis said, I worked a good deal of time at the Santa Fe Institute, and this turned out to be a story about butterfly effects. So just to remind you, you all know what a butterfly effect is, but just to remind you, this is 1961, Edward Lawrence has to stop a computer simulation of the weather, right? Because he's off to get a cup of coffee. So he starts it up again, but he doesn't maintain all of the memory now, loses 6 decimal places. Not only stores 6, and he's re-entering the data from 3, and so it turns out that even though the difference between previous run and the restart is tiny, very soon those 2 runs begin to diverge. And that was the discovery of the butterfly effect. It turns out that, as Lawrence concluded in his paper about this, systems can sometimes exhibit these interesting forms of behavior due to the mathematics rather than anything intrinsic to the physical phenomenon. So that's a butterfly effect. And butterflies, we know, can create chaos. That's what Lawrence's story is about. But I'm going to stretch this just a little and talk about the emergence of unexpected order from small things. Okay. So in 2009, I've been working with Indonesian geneticists, and you'll see in a minute who they are. So we discovered that one of the largest barriers to human migrations, equivalent to the Sahara or the Himalayas, is located in the middle of a chain of islands which have been continuously occupied since people got there about 55,000 years ago. So that's a mystery, right? Why should that be? The difference here is that most of the people on this side of the Wallace line have Asian genetics. Their ancestry is genetics. Over here, they're mostly so-called Papuans, and I'll tell you in a minute what that difference is. And in here, there's this odd gap. So why on this chain of islands should there be a gap of that sort? In the absence of any physical barrier, there has to be some other sort of explanation, probably having to do with human behavior. And it happens that it occurs along Wallace's line, Alfred Russel Wallace's line, which is the Pleistocene boundary between Asia and Australasia. Everybody's heard of Wallace? And Wallace's line was indeed a barrier to Australia. Only marsupials got over there. Over here we've got placental mammals, but it wasn't a barrier to humans because we can swim across those islands, okay? Very narrow. So, question then is, why is there this barrier, this sharp discontinuity along a continuous chain of islands that have been inhabited for about at least 55,000 years? Second question emerges from looking at this, which is a sex bias, because it turns out that the X chromosomes, which spend 2/3 of their time in women and only 1/3 of their time in men, predominate up here. The autosomes, which are 50-50, when we go through the process we call sex, we swap them equally, okay? So there we see less female influence, you could say. And then finally, we conclude that the Austronesian women's ancestry is more Asian than the men's from that data. So there's just an odd fact, and you could ask, does it really matter, or is it a small effect? Could we actually, Rob, if you're going to be able to see this, we might want just a little less light so you can read it? If anybody's, would that be okay?
It's for the film.
Okay, well, never mind, we'll just squint, okay, just squint. So here's the data, okay, here are these islands. We're in eastern Indonesia, there's Australia. Here's the percent of Asian DNA, right, for the island of Sumba, for example. So the mitochondrial DNA, which everybody gets from their mom, and is thus through the matriline, is almost entirely Asian. Fathers give sons their Y chromosome, and that turns out to be almost entirely Papuan. And here are the X chromosomes again, which are biased towards female. Okay, 2/3, and they're more female. And then here are the autosomes, which is most of your DNA, which is 50-50. So it looks like there's an enormous bias in this genetic inheritance, which goes right across, and actually the furthest out here is Polynesia, and so the further out you go on the track that humans took as they colonized those islands, the more evident that bias becomes. So evidently the Austronesian women got all the way to Hawaii, but the men didn't. So it raises the question, what happened? You know, did the women toss them out of the canoes at some point? I mean, what led to this strange disappearance? Did they get tired of paddling? Something must have happened along the way. simply didn't make it. Okay, so that's a question. Then there's a third question, which is, as we look across those islands, these guys, the Asians carrying their Austronesian genes, also took their Austronesian languages, probably from Taiwan, and settled out. And as they sailed down in these little bitty sailing canoes, they would have encountered islands that were already populated. As we look now across the Pacific, almost everybody speaks an Austronesian language. So there's a near total replacement of all the languages that were spoken over more than half the surface of the globe by Austronesian languages. It's the last human expansion into pristine environments. It's the last great phase of human Neolithic colonizations, and it's the most total language. This is the most widespread language in the world until modern media was developed. So how did they manage this, since they were arriving on islands, like big islands like Borneo, there were plenty of people who had their own languages? Thank you very much. So, what happened to lead to the disappearance? So when we talked about this with geneticists, we had scenarios usually involving murders, right? The slaughter of Austronesian men, you had to come up with some kind of explanation that would get the women out there, not the men, and replace the languages. So that's the puzzle, okay? Here are the languages. This is the Austronesian family tree. They're all very closely related. The only place where people don't speak them is in Papua New Guinea, where there seems to have been what Peter Bellwood calls a Neolithic standoff. Those guys were also farmers, and they held their own. So here we have the Papuan languages. The rest of the region, it's the Austronesians.
Nearly all Pacific Islanders speak languages that are closely related, belonging to the Austronesian language family. Linguists have traced the origins of the Austronesian family to a language spoken on the island of Taiwan about 5,000 years ago. One theory suggests that the Austronesian voyages began from Taiwan. Sailing south, the Austronesians would have reached the islands of the Philippines, and then Indonesia. Some sailed on along the coast of Papua, and then on into the vast reaches of the Pacific.
Okay, so when they began these voyages, these islands were already occupied. So just retracing that, here humans leaving Africa around 200,000 years ago. They get up to India by about 70,000, and then if they're going to get to Australia by 55,000 years ago, they had to go through the islands. And their descendants are still there, along with the languages. Okay, so those are whom we're calling the Papuans. Then things quiet down for 45,000 years, and now come the Neolithic, meaning the farming peoples, the Austronesians, and here they come. So a great controversy among prehistorians is exactly which route they took, but for our purposes, we don't really care. Somehow they came from Asia, the Austronesian languages are Asian, and they moved down and colonized these islands, getting out here by 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Okay, so off they go. And we've got Austronesians and Papuans. Those are the two names you need to remember. So here are three questions again. The first is, why is there this enormous barrier, like the Sahara, except it's not? Okay. The second question is, why is there a sex bias in the genes? And the third question is, what led to the language replacement in the islands that the Austronesians happened to reach?
So something must have happened to the Austronesians as they traveled through the islands of Indonesia. Was there a change in the organization of their societies? Did women begin to play a more important role? DNA might give us clues, but until now, we have very few DNA samples from Indonesia. That's how this project began. I thought that if we could collect both language and DNA samples from the islands that were the stepping stones for the Austronesian migration, then we might be able to tease out the different histories of men and women. But for that, we would need more samples. In 2000, I met an Indonesian doctor who was already collecting DNA, and we decided to work together. Herawati Sudoyo is the executive director of the Ekman Institute for Molecular Biology in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. Hera's goal is to map the genetic diversity of the archipelago and learn about the evolutionary history of tropical diseases.
So we decided to head for the island of Sumba, which is one of the remoter islands of the eastern part of the Indonesian archipelago. We knew that it was populated by the Austronesians. We suspected they might still be there, so we decided to go try and figure out what happened in Sumba with respect to these questions. Okay? And off we go. It was undoubtedly populated by Papuan-speaking peoples tens of thousands of years before the Austronesians got there. So, what happened? That's our question.
Informasi dalam badan kita atau masing-masing yang membedakan antara satu dengan lain, atau membedakan satu suku dengan suku lain. Itu dengan diperiksa DNA-nya namanya, itu tadi gennya, itu kita bisa melihat sebenarnya asal-usulnya, mana yang paling tua, mana yang paling muda dari itu.
We're trying to work in parallel. While Hera explains our goals and collects the medical data, my job is to reconstruct the history of the Austronesians on Sumba. Was there only one migration to the island? Or were there several at different times? The first question that needs to be answered is, why are there so many languages on this little island?
We're in the village of Waimangura in northwest Sumba. Public health staff and the team from the Eichmann Institute are collecting health histories, talking about malaria, hepatitis, answering people's questions, and collecting some samples. But I'm going to be asking questions about language. There are 8 domains in West Sumba, each of which has its own individual language, most of which are unintelligible from one little domain to the other. There's even one region just to the north of here where there's a language that's spoken by people in only 3 villages.
If there was only one Austronesian migration to Sumba, all of these languages should trace back to a single mother language that would have been brought to the island by the first colonists. But it's also possible that there was more than one migration. So we need to collect samples of language variation and use them to reconstruct the history of all the languages of Sumba.
This is East Sumba, July 2005. This tape is going to have a third of 3 tapes containing word lists. Oh, good heavens, sorry.
Okay. Minum, em, ciao, do, ikan, berenang, ngan, gigit.
We can use changes in the sound patterns of these words to trace the historical relationships between the languages that are now spoken on Sumba.
186 terbang.
Take the English word to fly. It would be translated differently in each of the languages of Sumba.
Nawurna, 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 nawurna. Tavuruna, nawuruna, tavuruna, nawuruna. Nawurungo, 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 nawurungo. Aurum, 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 aurum. Aurum, 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 aurum.
So far, the linguistic evidence suggests that all of the languages of Sumba fall into 5 regional clusters, and they all derive from a single Austronesian language, which would have been spoken about 3,000 years ago. We can also see that there was not much mixing of languages once the Indonesians settled on the island. That's important for the medical research. It means that small clusters of villages that spoke the same language remained isolated for many centuries, giving time for each population to adapt to local conditions. The next step is to see how that pattern fits with the genetic data. There's a deep connection between language and genes. People tend to choose marriage partners who speak their own language, and over time that channels the flow of genes. Even though there are lots of languages, it's actually easy for a Sumbanese to tell if someone speaks their language. Just look at the clothes they're wearing. The patterns woven into the clothing mark a person's clan and where they're from. The patterns in the cloth will tell you at a glance whether someone belongs to a clan that you're allowed to marry, and what language they're likely to speak. But occasionally, people marry strangers, and that will bring different genes into a village. And sometimes people learn new languages. So languages and DNA can travel different paths down through the centuries. By gathering samples of both words and genes from many villages, We're hoping to retrace those journeys into the past.
So on Sumba, what we find is a simple story. This is the percentage of Austronesian words that are retained in languages. And here is the Austronesian genes, haplogroup O, which happens to be a marker for Austronesian origins. So you see there's some relationship here. The more Austronesian genes they retain, the more Austronesian words are also present in the language. So the highest retention turns out to occur in the eastern part of the island, small island, but this is actually the driest piece of land in all of Indonesia, and the population density is much smaller there, it's much lower there. The Sumbanese believe that their ancestors arrived once at Cape Bungo, which is up the northernmost part of the island. So the evidence begins to look like it might be right, but could they remember something that happened so distantly, so far back in the past?
Here's Bungo on the north coast, the driest piece of land in all of Indonesia. The Austronesian colonists brought their genes and their languages with them. When we started this research, it was thought that the Austronesians moved out in a great wave, replacing or blending with the people who were there before. But our new data tell a different story. Austronesian genes are found in small clumps, and the same is true of their languages. Today, some villages have retained a lot of Austronesian words in their local dialect, but others have not. So here's what we think might have happened. Sumba was already populated by hunter-gatherers. They would have been concentrated in the west, where there's more rainfall. The Austronesians arrive, build their village, and as their population grows, begin to create new villages. The villages in the west would have been surrounded by indigenous peoples, speaking different languages. As the two groups intermarried, the proportion of Austronesian words and genes would gradually fall off, but in the east, the Austronesian villages would have been more isolated and retained more of their original genes and language.
Today, the culture of Sumba is dominated by men. But we know that in the past, at some point, women played a much more important role. So when and where did that change begin? On the island of Flores, just to the north of Sumba, there's said to be some matrilineal villages where descent is traced through the female line and women have a lot of power. Could those villages be relics from the time when the Austronesian culture began to change and women assumed more power? We decided to go to Flores and take a look.
This village of Bena in the mountains of central Flores looks a lot like the villages in Sumba. We've got the houses with the tall thatched roofs and the stone tombs to the ancestors just in front of them. But there's an important difference. The villages in Sumba are patrilineal, the men are in charge, whereas here this village is matrilineal. It means that the houses are owned by women, that both men and women inherit their rights to property through their mothers, and so the matriline is stronger here. This could be important because the genetic data from the Pacific suggests that the Austronesian voyagers might have been a matrilineal society. The question we want to ask is, what difference does it make?
Biasanya, Bapak, kalau yang diturunkan berdasarkan ibu, itu warisan biasanya diberikan lebih banyak kepada anak perempuan. Nah, apakah di sini juga terjadi hal seperti itu?
Ya memang ini sudah turun-temurun sejak dari kami punya orang tua.
Ya.
Tapi yang beranak adalah perempuan. Sedangkan bagaimana perempuan itu untuk pengeluaran atau omong apa-apa, kita harus satukan dengan saudara-saudara orang tuanya.
In Bena, women have a lot of power. It's one of a handful of matrilineal villages where women own things like livestock and land, and children inherit from their mothers. When we analyzed the genetic samples from Bena, we learned that the matrilineal villages on Flores are only a few hundred years old. So the genetic samples from Bena are much too recent to tell us anything about the Austronesian voyagers. But there's still another chance. On the island of Timor, just to the south of Flores, deep in the interior, there's another cluster of matrilineal villages. And there's reason to believe that these villages are very old, much older than the matrilineal villages on Flores.
So there's Sumba. Entirely patrilineal. Most of these villages, most of these islands now are patrilineal. The men are in charge. A couple little villages in Flores we just visited, but here in Timor, this region called Wehali has been known since the earliest European voyages as they called it a kingdom, actually, a matrilineal kingdom. It's famous in anthropology, so we decided to have a look at Wehali.
Here in Wehali, men still think of themselves as warriors. But as in all matrilineal societies, they share power with women. There are written records from the colonial era that prove that Wehali was a matrilineal center before the first Europeans arrived in the islands, 400 years ago. In the center of the innermost village, there's a sacred dwelling for the female rulers of Wehali. In the 17th century, the Portuguese were vying for control of this part of Indonesia. And in 1642, they sent an expedition here to destroy the kingdom of Wehali, but after burning down the buildings they left, the buildings were undefended, and nothing changed. The reason is Wehali is not organized like a European kingdom. Here, women rule. The lady to my side here is the Naimea, means she is the ruler of Wehali.
Oops.
The lady to my side here.
There we go. Oh dear, sorry, hang on. Well, we're missing a clip.
The lady to my side here is the Naimea.
We'll survive without it. What we learned from Wehali, what she explains is that they're a matrilineal village. They speak Austronesian languages. They're surrounded by some villages that are Papuan. So those guys have Papuan languages and Papuan genes. And from time to time, they'll accept a husband from the Papuan culture at low frequencies. So when that happens, what language will the children speak? If they're living in the mother's Austronesian language, they'll speak Austronesian language. They'll inherit their mother's Asian mitochondrial DNA and their father's Papuan Y chromosome, right? So if that happens over time, here we go, that's what that shows. So we built a model to see what would be the effects. So here's a model in which a few Papuan men at some very small frequency marry into these matrilineal Austronesian villages. The children speak the mother's Austronesian language. They inherit some genes from their Asian mother and some from their Papuan dad. And so there's that model where we're assuming that the frequency in which this occurs, in other words, accepting a Papuan husband from outside, is maybe 2%. Run that forward 50 generations and you get this distribution. Oops. It's very simple, it's just the rate of intermarriage and the amount of time. There are about 120 or 40 generations to play with. So if you run this forward for 50 generations, that's what you get. So here's the actual distribution of the genetic materials. Notice we've got 4 different independent genetic systems, and that's the distribution that emerges with that simple model. So we can play with the rate of intermarriage, we can play with the rate of how many generations this occurs, but this explains the genetic distribution, and also that it's progressive so that it increases, the effect progresses as you move east, following their colonizing expeditions towards Hawaii. So that not only predicts the pattern in Wehali, but it suggests that an explanation for the 3 questions that we looked at, the replacement of Papuan languages by Austronesian languages, and the genetic differences, right, that sex bias that we see. So, can you read that? Over tens of generations. Here's our butterfly effect. A small bias, 2%, right? And the admixture rates in the natural local societies produces this enormous change in the genetic composition of the region, and also the replacement of all the languages with Papuan languages. Nobody had to die, nobody had to leave the canoe, no murders, very peaceful conquest. And yet now, sadly, there are only a few of these natural local societies left. And this, we think, is interesting because were it not for the genetics, that history would be lost. It looks as though the women, I was working mostly with female Indonesian geneticists, and we got this result. They said, oh my goodness, So it's we're the heroes, we're the heroines of this story. It's our people who colonized the Pacific. The girls did it. Okay, so there we are. But then this led to it, so we rejoiced at that discovery, but then it led to another question, which is what happened to these matrilineal societies? What causes this alternation between matrilineal and patrilineal? So Claude Lévi-Strauss came up with a theory about this. Actually, he was looking at Northwest Coast American Indians, but he came up with an interesting model, which he called house society, société à maison, which he says can appear in hierarchical societies from time to time. And translating loosely from the French, what he says is you can alternate. If you are the chief of this house, then you want to maintain alliances with other houses. You may be rather indifferent as to whether they are patrilocal or matrilocal. The point is to maintain those alliances. And in fact, what we see is a strong, if we go back to the language, the Austronesian language, the idea of dualism, of the importance of male and female, father and mother, Ana and Ina, we see right across these islands. So they retained that emphasis, the idea of a duality. So that suggests that Austronesian culture, because it spread across all those islands, has always had that emphasis on both male and female principles. So what happened? Okay, well, we noticed that you can make a very simple genetic calculation. If you live matrilocally, if your village is matrilocal like Wehale, the women stay here and they bring in men, right? Then you have fewer female ancestors and more males in the population, right? More men moving into the village, pulling in the men, marrying them and producing children. On the other hand, if it's patrilocal, you'll have the opposite. The men stay put, the women move in. So that over time, iterated over time, if the villages are relatively permanent, as they are on these islands, is going to leave the signature. But the Société Maison is going to suggest an alteration. No strong bias one way or the other. So what do we find? Well, here is you can calculate from those of us in this room, we could take your mitochondrial DNA in your village, if you happen to be in a village, and find out what is the population of female ancestresses who would produce our village. How many would be needed to create this diversity? So also with the males. So if you took my mito DNA and my Y chromosome, you did that with the other guys in my village, we could see, is there a bias? Were we patrilocal or matrilocal in the past? More females or more males, okay? So that's the calculation, and here are the patrilocal societies. So there's more female diversity. Here are the matrilocal ones. Notice that this is a continuous distribution, and that's not how it would be if they were one or the other. In other words, we would expect clumps. If they were strongly patrilocal or strongly matrilocal, we would expect this, right? But we don't see it. Instead, we see continuous variation. So that suggests maybe they have been playing around with this, not strongly one way or the other over the years. So here we have a simple model producing this new regime of order. Lévi-Strauss assumed that there was no inherent trajectory to the destiny of house societies. They might move one way or the other, but here we actually see a change, right? In Lawrence's model, just tiny variation produces chaotic dynamics. In this model, changing the parameter of occasional marriages from outsider Papuan males changes the genetic and the linguistic composition of all these islands. So I'm claiming that this explains the first two questions, the progressive sex bias and also the spread of the languages, but it doesn't actually explain the first question, which is why is there that big barrier, right, between Asians and the Papuans, that big genetic, this barrier, this sharp discontinuity right along the islands. Okay, so for that we need, go to Bali. Those of you who know me knew we were headed there. So here we are in Bali. Barrier begins just to the east of the island of Bali. That happens to be the border of the region where wet rice has been cultivated for 1,000 or so years. And the thing about paddy rice is, once you've developed an irrigation system and built a village that depends upon paddy rice, you are unlikely to leave it. So in Bali, these are statistics on marriages within these communities. That, you can't see it, but that's 100%. So here we have 13 villages. The average marriage to someone within one's community is about 85%. These are little villages, so they're very restrictive in their marriage choices. They stay put and marry one another, and in this way maybe achieve strong bonds of cooperation. that makes these populations very stable, and it stops the movement of populations that we see in the tribal societies to the east, where people move around a lot more, horses to the east, okay? Very endogamous people, and so if we do the same calculation with the Balinese, they claim to be patrilocal, but in fact they're right in the middle, because both men and women stay in the same village, right? So this, we think, created a barrier. People just stopped moving out past those rice terraces. They stayed put in Mali. Generation after generation, they stayed home and married the neighbors' daughters. And then apparently nobody wanted to leave Mali, which is still a problem. So here's my butterflies. These little changes in marriage practices may have had a transformative effect, and that got us interested in the question of romance.
Who would you rather kiss on your very last chance of another start? And how would you rise again on a difficult slope
Couldn't
with a
resist.
broken heart? Small decisions, life incisions, big in retrospect. Racing gently, consequently, the butterfly effect.
Thank you. Putting up with this. Okay, so we've got butterflies flapping their wings. One more question about the composition of these villages. What can we read out of this history? The conventional wisdom is that men compete for status, and the reward for status is more wives and more children. That's sort of lesson one from human behavioral ecology. There are lots of people who made this claim. Bobby Lowe says in more than 100 well-studied societies, clear, formal reproductive rewards for men are associated with status. High-ranking men have the right to more wives. So the question is, would this produce, if that were true in general, then that would have a very strong directional change in marriage patterns. Sweep away the butterflies, right? And create a big selective effect. So do we actually see it? Well, see if I get, does this status competition among men within these villages have any lasting effect, or do the butterflies of love keep stirring things up? Okay, so we can ask that question in our villages, and here are love's history in 41 villages. Actually, by now it's 69 villages in lots of islands. What are the possibilities? So it could be that dominant men have more children, and over time, the Lansings, if we're the dominants, take over, and you'd have lots of Lansings in your village. If we had even a small reproductive effect, if I could pass on my talent for status to my sons and grandsons, right? There'd be lots of Lansings. On the other hand, it could be neutral, and you might find this might just be, continuous drift, or there could be a red queen effect. Red queen in evolutionary biology. Here's the red queen explaining to Alice that sometimes it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place, and in biology it just means fluctuating dominance. First one gets ahead than the other, but nobody actually wins. Short-term competition. So what do we see? Okay, well here, using our genetics, we trace patrilines. Here's a phylogeny, here's me, and we can just look at fast mutating things on the molecule, down little twigs on these branches, like microsats. And so they're my distant cousins, and they're my very distant kin. Just how many pit flips, if you like, how many mutations have occurred to distinguish me from my cousins and my more remote ancestors. We're all human in the end, right? So you can then calculate the frequency distribution of the descent groups, guys who share common ancestry, the way biologists do. So here we have, this is the number of patrilineal groups, or haplogroups if you like, just shared descent on the male side. So each of these are all unique. Here are a bunch that are individual. Each one is of a different descent. Here's one haplogroup that is shared by 23 men. So this was a successful grandfather, okay, who had lots of male descendants. So we're just looking at the frequency distribution of patrilineal groups in the villages, okay, so these are all unique. So there's a lot of influx maybe, or whatever, something strange. So these guys would be less dominant, if this group became really successful, these unique individuals would disappear pretty quickly. So do we see that happening, okay? So if we assume that these patrilines compete, and we just give them a simulation and a little bit more advantage, how long does it take, how many thousand years before the population becomes completely Lansings, for example? If the Lansing started out and got good at this. It takes a long time. Eventually only one is left if you have a selection effect. But on the other hand, we've got drift occurring too. So what do we actually see? Well, here are a bunch of villages. You can make no sense of this, but here's a simulation. Here's what happens. Here's our population. We start with only one haplogroup, just one Lansing in the village. I have children. As time goes on, however, mutations occur in the haplogroup, creating new ones. So diversity happens, and pretty soon we get within about 15 generations, we come to an equilibrium where new mutations happen, but drift removes some of them, and we wind up in that state. Or we could start with 200 different kinds of men. As time goes on, those are going to get weeded out, and again, within about 20 generations, we'll wind up at a drift equilibrium, drift mutation equilibrium. So that's after that. In other words, this is out of equilibrium, and then here we reach equilibrium. So what then do we see? This is everybody different, is everybody the same? Here's the neutral distribution. It turns out that they're all neutral. All of the samples that we looked at, except for three villages that were created during Dutch times as administrative centers that are not sort of natural villages but are communities. Those show actually not dominance but the reverse, more diversity, because guys were brought from many places into those villages. Otherwise, lo and behold, we see neutrality. So that's interesting, partly because here's the age or the time to the most recent common ancestor of the major male lineages in this part of Asia. You can't see the numbers, but this is 36,000 years, 39,000 years. It's a long time ago. If it were the case that there was much competition and male dominance weeding out the weak, then we'd see less diversity. Instead, it looks as though diversity happens. And thus, this is close to neutral or maybe a red queen competition. It doesn't mean that men don't compete. On the island of Simla, the guys carry swords, and they do their best to have lots of wives and children, but they are unable to pass them on for more than a generation or two. Consequently, it has no evolutionary effect. It keeps them amused, but it doesn't produce change in the genetic composition of the population. Okay, so 2 points to make, and I'm nearing the end of this part of the story. Global patterns, okay? What we've just seen is these patrilines compete for social dominance, but they don't succeed at it. And so there's no evolutionary effect. It's a wash. It's just drift, indistinguishable from neutral change. Equilibrium, therefore, and genetic diversity are preserved, sustained. Thank you, Red Queen, for maintaining diversity in our populations. On the other hand, this little change that we mentioned earlier of women's marriage patterns, that little effect probably rewrote the history of the islands and the languages of the region. So 2 little things. On the one hand, maintaining just this small, quivering equilibrium, right? Trembling hands called equilibrium, diversity among the males, and then secondly, a change in the females. So now finally, if you've been with me, to what does this mean for regime shifts and resilience? Does this stuff matter at all? I'll take you back to Bali. 85,000 hectares of rice lands in Bali, managed by villages. Subaks are groups of farmers who share water from a common source, and they've been around since the 10th, 11th century. They are the village-sized groups of guys who manage rice terraces like those. But sometimes, by and large they succeed, but sometimes they fail. And the Balinese, who are now, we just got a proposal for a World Heritage Site in Bali to celebrate the Subaks, we need to know why they fail. So here's a place where we looked, once again with the genetic stuff, looking at 8 different Subaks along the river, where we had some genetic data. I knew from hanging around with these people that these Subaks seemed to be more confident in their ability to solve their problems. The ones down below seem to have more problems. So we asked them some questions, like on a survey, like a 45-minute survey, how well can my Subak cope with problems? Here's the answer. It's the mean response from the upper Subaks, and here's from the lower ones. So you can see in general these upstream guys are just more confident. They think their Subak is able to handle things better than the guys down there. Here's how effective are the sanctions that your Subak imposes for people who don't do the right thing. They all impose sanctions, but it's not guaranteed they work, right? So there's Dominique Soskat. Anyway, so once again, the upstream guys are very confident that their sanctions will work. The downstream guys are not so sure that their sanctions will succeed, and so forth. So we then take all these different questions and plot them. We take 11-dimensional space, reduce it down to 2, and we see what's the pattern of relationship between, for example, questions like, how important are caste differences in the ability of your subak to survive? How important is the presence of sharecroppers versus owners in your subak? All kinds of, how good is your subak at organizing rituals, things like that. So we reduce that down and we say, here's the correlation matrix for the upper subaks, and here's for the lower subaks. So if you don't know familiar with this diagram, outside this red circle, it becomes significant. The closer the longer the vector, the stronger the influence, and the closer they are in space, the more closely correlated they are. So knowing that, you can see that they look like very different patterns. So, are these different regimes? In other words, you can take a variable like caste or sharecroppers. How the importance of how many sharecroppers there are in your village matters differently here versus there. Same variable, different effect. If you took an aggregate, if you took this data and looked at the whole system, you'd see a lot more variation, you'd be lost in the variation. Or if you took it community by community, you'd see some pattern. But by looking at this, what we're seeing is, well, actually these forces are felt differently depending on whether you're a subak in the upstream or the downstream part of the river. So then finally, we plot these differences. So here are the upstream guys, here are these 4 subaks, who are generally happy. And notice that they're pretty tightly clustered because all happy families are the same. Here are the ones who are downstream. They are not so happy, but they go wrong in kind of different ways. Okay? The 2 ellipses show that actually they are statistically separated. So we can then infer that they look like different regimes. And then you can, the next obvious question is, what does it take to get from there to there, to become a successful subak? And the answer, we don't know the answer, but what you can do is say, well, treat this now as a energy landscape and say, well, what is the minimum free energy pathway that will take you from that domain to that one? Take these 2 equilibrium points and ask, what are the key variables dominating the transition? We're about to redo this thing in 3 dimensions, but if you can imagine, this is like a little harmonic well, and this is a shallower one. So they've got to kind of climb up out of one well and then go down into the other. And what are the main variables that determine what the likely path would be to solve that problem, to either get better or to get worse? So it turns out sanctions and the mobilization of labor, of all the different variables that we're looking at, those 2 seem to dominate, which, if you had to pick, a guess as to what might be the triggers that would really matter, being able to mobilize the troops and the effectiveness of sanctions may be reasonable guesses. So what falls out of this then is a hypothesis about what might be the transition path. First of all, we've discovered that there are 2 equilibrium states, right? That there are 2 regimes that are different. And the second thing we learn as well, here's a hypothesis to be tested with respect to how things might change from one to the other. Next step, return to Bali and look at a bunch more subaks. Okay, so final question, why? Why is there this difference? Okay, well, this is the genetic composition of these villages. Those guys are here. I don't have the neck, I shouldn't give you, but it's very simple. Here's how much diversity there is, so that's how long the village has stayed put with nobody coming in, right? And we just find less diversity in the lower subaks, on the mother's side and the father's side, than the father's. These guys have more diversity, and they're not as happy. Those guys have less diversity, and they seem to be getting along better. Why should that be? Well, I don't think we're not looking at actual genes. What we're looking at is the length of time that families have stayed in one place and learned about the consequences of failures, right? So, long shared history in those villages. In the downstream villages, the genetic evidence is consistent either with a shorter history or with more migrants, then in either case they haven't had the advantage of having villages that have been around for decades and centuries facing the consequences of failure in their irrigation systems. So what we conclude is it is a famous grandmother hypothesis in behavioral ecology that says that grandmothers may have been very important in the past. One of the reasons we may live to a ripe old age is old people may take some important role in parental investment in caring for the young. Grandmothers might matter. And this suggests maybe also grandmothers might matter. That is to say, the old people who have experienced problems in these subocs know what happens when cooperation fails, and how to deal with environmental variation, environmental changes. They're there. Whereas migrants, new people coming into the village, don't have that kind of long-term family investment. So a small change, it could be, this is just hypothesis, it could be just a small change in the demographic composition of those villages might be what matters with respect to how well they can get along with each other, essentially. Okay, and that's the story. That's the story. So, thank you very much.